Well, firstly, I'm afraid this might be light relief. I was very struck this morning by the comment that if you haven't sorted out your philosophical positions, you're in trouble. And so I'm pretty much in trouble. And I'm not entirely being frivolous. I thought I might tell you something about me before I go into it, because it's to do with what function doctorates have in our society. I'm an ersatz academic. I have 8 doctorates, none of them earned at all, just purely in order to entertain students for those 10 minutes between when they get their piece of paper and you all shuffle out of an honorary degree ceremony. I'm a professor at 2-3 universities, but I've never been a proper academic. Well, you know, I've taught for the odd term. And, but what I have, I'm going to say those things at the start, because if you've got properly earned qualifications, structures, roles in the academy, you can, as I think you were suggesting just before lunch, there's a sort of legitimacy in your criticising your institution from your experience. And mine is constantly playfully from just outside. I've spent my working life really for a quarter of a century and more at the interface between research, practice and policy. I had rather privileged job running the National Institute for Adult Education, Adult Continuing Education in England, which had a very large body of researchers working on adult learning, probably bigger than in any of the academic departments. But my significant role was getting up in the morning and saying, and adults to government, otherwise they'd forget, because adult learning is in the margins of all of the education processes. But I think the experience that rather curious and distinctive job threw up does point towards interesting questions about what kind of structuring of the space to reflect and think and bring intellectual rigour leaders and managers can benefit from, and to ask how that sits alongside the apprenticeship function which doctorates have traditionally played as a rite of passage into academic life, whether you carry on in the academy or are just recognised as competent in that way. So the first thing I took from, I met Alison at a university seminar here where Rosemary Deem came and talked. One of the things she said was, we look to think tanks to generate debates about value and policy rather than higher education. The policy community, by and large in our field, doesn't actually expect to use educational research activity on a regular basis, except where it confirms prejudices. And some of that is, I think, to do with the forms of intellectual production involved. And I want to sort of arrive at the point where we have a conversation about that. So what kind of doctoral studies are best fitted to people acting not only at a personal leadership level, but institutional leadership or societal leadership roles? What kind of impact might they have on practices in a changing world, on policy, and how best to secure time, rigour, value in the study? What kind of forms might there best be? Because if you look from outside at the academy, frankly, PhDs in the natural sciences look very different from the conversation we were just having before lunch about autonomous, independent, and free, separate people, when you're in a research team of 15 PhD students and a research supervisor all working on dimensions of a challenge in biological, chemical science on the borders. All of them will get their PhD, as a sort of rubber stamp at the end of an apprenticeship model. Very different than sitting and writing the Tractatus, I think. So those are some initial caveats. The second thing I wanted to say is we have, partly as a result of mainly as a result of marketization of higher education and globalization at the same time, become increasingly international institutions, and I want to worry about whether we're alive enough to different forms of intellectual tradition to be able to do that job properly. I thought that was one of the implications of what Joseph was sharing with us this morning. The third caveat before I begin is the job to reproduce or to transform the social order. And I think what's absolutely common between our goals between this morning and this afternoon is I'm really interested in the ways you can create a more egalitarian society, one in which the manifest inequalities and injustices that we have can be ameliorated and transformed, and how far does the work of the academy and doctoral studies in particular help tool you up for that activity, or how much does it get in the way of it? And so that, and then boundaries. Because I work in adult learning, I'm acutely aware that that we have malleable boundaries. It's much easier if you're thinking about what happens in a primary school to have a degree of limitation of structure. You know, children, of course, things happen before they arrive, but they arrive, you plan your curriculum for the day, you've got things to think about when they've gone, but as a predictable and shared set of experiences that pretty much the whole cohort of a country will go through, you know that people teaching in primary schools have lots of different challenges, but within a common set of frames. Work with adults is more complicated than that. I mean, it is a very minor, modest part of the structured education system, whether in further education frameworks here or in community-based learning. A very large amount happens mostly informally in the workplace, but non-formal, informal and formal structures coexist with one another and make data much harder to get a hold of and think about firmly, or contexts have a pressure. And the response to that around action research, reflective practice and so on informs what I plan to talk about. But that's probably enough caveats, because otherwise you'll have to go home. I'll begin to get on with it. So agency, adult learning and globalization is the subject I want to talk about. And in The Treasure Within, the UNESCO paper Jacques Delors chaired the committee for a decade ago, 15 years ago, he argued that there are basically four pillars for a learning society: that we should learn how to know, how to do, how to be, and how to live together. And I think anybody looking at our education training system would have to say we're much better at thinking about how to learn to know things and how to do things than we are around what it is to become fully human, how it is to be at ease with yourself. And certainly we've a long way to go to live in harmony with one another. I thought, there were elements of the Quranic education impressions that we had this morning that fitted very well with the argument about learning to live together. But so that's one thing to keep in mind, that adult learning is about all of those things. And my framework of thinking really derives politically, I suppose, from Raymond Williams, the Welsh European literary critic, but more importantly, educator, cultural studies man, who wrote that at times of change, adults turn to learning to understand what's going on, to adapt to it, to make adjustments in the light of it, and to shape change. And I think the core of the work of adult education, certainly for adult learning, certainly for social transformation, is addressing each of those three in order to secure an active and informed democracy and in order to minimise exclusion. And so what I really want to do is just talk through some contexts of the work of adult learning to establish a framework in which you think, well, where does doctoral studies fit into all of that? So it may seem quite a long way from what we were talking about this morning, but I said it's sort of light relief for the afternoon. So, firstly, these are uncertain times, and I mean each of these bullet points, and you could add to them, throws up real shifts and challenges in our perspective of what counts, what's included. The globalisation of goods and services, one feature of which is the number of international students in our universities here, but there are all kinds of other consequences. I'll show you a bit about that in a minute. Economic crises, you can't but, if you work in FAE, see a relationship between budgets for adult learning in Britain and the war in Iraq, or budgets in adult Britain and the irresponsibility of Boston bankers, or London bankers too. Climate change, I want to come back to. Demographic change in two very different demographic dynamics. Half the people in the world who have difficulties with reading and writing are in societies where more than half the population is under 15. Well, that's a dramatically different world than the one ageing industrial societies like ours are living with, where the argument is that the person's now been born who lived to 150, and for whom the life sentence of life after what we think of as a working life is going to stretch our ideas about what education's for quite dramatically. We already see people active learners in their 90s and hundreds. Technological change, dramatic differences around, the organisation I stopped working at NICE last year and became president of the International Council of Adult Education. We do almost all our work by Skype. It's so different than it was 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, when you had to fly to Montevideo once a year and squeeze a ridiculous amount of work into a 2 or 3 day meeting. Community cohesion, which is thrown up by challenges around a world in which huge numbers of people are migrating. People were telling me last week from China that 200 million people in China migrated in the last 10 years from the countryside to the cities. Well, that sense of where do I belong and of who's coming and pushing me out of the way, it's a feature of the modern world that the people who are left behind feel bereft of resources. The people who move don't feel that they quite belong anymore where they came from or where they arrive, and the people who are arrived too sometimes feel that their elbow room is under pressure, and there are learning agendas attached to all of those changes too. Contested values, well, we spoke a bit about that, and a huge democratic deficit. One I think of as best characterised by a world which goes on as though one person, one vote is the answer, where really it seems that $1, one vote is a better description of how our democracies really work. So what I see in Britain as a result of some of those changes at home are accelerating inequality. Each of these has, you might say, well, what's the educational agenda that arises from each bullet point, really? Declining living standards for most middle and low income families, huge policy instability, sharply rising youth and older adult unemployment, problems of how are you going to manage an ageing society, crisis in affording care, the marketisation of education with increased utilitarianism and narrowing of the spaces for people to ask questions about the meaning of life or of a life worth living in, a society worth living in, cuts in company training, adult learning going down the tubes, frankly, very many fewer participants and fewer opportunities to participate than a decade ago, including significantly a decline in higher education's focus on lifelong learning in the education